Carol Evans, Professor of Higher Education in the University of Southampton, ahead of your National Forum seminar on developing manageable, meaningful assessments. You're very welcome, Carol. Carol, the Trinity Education Framework and the Trinity Education Project has a focus on fewer, more meaningful assessments. We often hear our staff and our students talk about the challenges of the assessment workload. So how can we enable our staff to have fewer assessments across the curriculum without compromising the integrity of the assessment processes itself?
I think if we talk about the integrity of the assessment process, I would want to start back with the learning outcomes. And actually, are those outcomes that we really want to measure? So are those the attributes, the graduate attributes that we would like students at Trinity to be leaving Trinity with? Are they the skill sets, the understanding and knowledge that they're going to need in this century and also in the next century? How relevant are they? And then once we've got that, the other question I've got is, do we really need to assess every single thing? So if we're actually getting the assessments right, and they actually are the best type of assessment to measure those learning outcomes, we shouldn't need to have to test all the minutiae along the way. I would advocate far more formative work, but I'm not saying that that's a load on the staff. Yes, it is in terms of design. Don't get me wrong. That will take longer in the outset, but students should be able to manage that for themselves, as well as, especially if the formative links directly into the summative. So students can self-test as they go through the programme themselves so that they can get an understanding of where they are and where they need to get to. And therefore, again, in going for meaningful assessment, it's not loads of more mini assessments. You're then actually aggravating the load, especially if it doesn't totally relate to what they need to do eventually. So it's really thinking about what are the actual key things that you want to assess and what would be the best way to assess them in a way that actually makes students own them, that they actually encourages them to actually demonstrate that knowledge, skills and understanding in a meaningful way.
So Carol, if you're thinking about programme level assessment or even subject level assessment, what would be the key recommendations that you would have in order to support that process?
Okay, good question. Lots. But key things was getting everybody in the room. One thing is getting the whole team in the room to actually look at, okay, let's start with the programme level outcomes that we want to achieve. Where would they best be placed within the particular modules or aspects of the discipline that we're looking at? It's also a matter of looking at the learning journey. So if you actually walked the journey as a student and you started off in year one and you walked through what they experienced from year one to year three, what would it be like for them? What would be the duplication? The big thing is it also needs compromise. So we don't want 9 posters at the end of year three. So it's where is assessment best placed and what type, but also how does one module feed on to the next or doesn't it? And it might be some modules are very distinct and very different, and that's okay, but the students need to know that. But also to look at the timing of where we actually place assessments. And there are lots of misunderstandings about that, because whatever I do in my module impacts on somebody else teaching another module. And we've all had that in terms of students not appearing because they're actually doing an assessment for somebody else, because they're attending to what's bothering them most. And we need to think about that whole pattern, that whole diet, and also what things we need to be progressive from year one to year three, and what things are discrete. Some knowledge is very discrete. How is that best assessed? Some knowledge we want and understanding and skills need to be developed all the way through. And where is the thread? So I would like people to weave the thread right the way through to say, this is how it's being developed. But again, it's very complicated if a programme has lots of optional elements to it. So how are you going to do it in your core programme? But actually, as a caveat to that, if students have a very free choice and can take lots of modules outside of the main programme, how are you validating those within the programme as well? And that's something people forget. And I think that's something we could do a lot more of.
Carol, we hear the word meaningful assessment a lot, and it means a lot to different people. So what does it mean to you?
Okay, big question there in terms of what do we mean by meaningful. So again, we could have a great big debate. Is it about deep approaches? What does a deep approach mean within a particular discipline, area? What is that all about? For me, it's about students owning assessment. It means that you actually have to be able to know it, to be able to deliver it. You cannot rote learn it. It means engaging in something to be able to articulate it, develop it, apply it to a different situation. And we could go through lots of different definitions of what meaningful actually is. For me, in terms of promoting that, how can we work with industry? How can we work with schools? How can we work with museums? How can we work with artists? What is there out there in terms of producing something that has value? But the issue there is value to the individual, but value in relation to that discipline and in terms of graduate skills and employability. All of those things in terms of, so for example, is a dissertation the only way to prove a detailed understanding of a concept? Would a journal article, which might help promote an individual's career, be more appropriate? Would a report, a business report, be more applicable in certain disciplines than an essay?
A performance, we're talking about performances, if that's appropriate.
So it's performances that actually relate to what an individual might need out there in the workplace, but also beyond their immediate discipline. Because remember, today, people may have many different career trajectories and different paths. So if we were trying to put together a whole skill set of things that they need to be able to do, what would those be? And how can they work with individuals in an authentic way to produce something of value that serves the requirements of assessment within the university, but actually contributes far more and beyond.
I agree totally. Carol, the Trinity assessment framework also focuses on engaging students as partners in assessment. And I know that this is an aspect of your research that's very interesting. So what does student engagement in assessment look like to you?
In my framework, I promote it that students are 50% responsible for assessment, which also means they're 50% responsible when it goes wrong. Now, I know there's a lot of dialogue about the level at which students can be involved in assessment, and so we have a massive continuum from being totally involved to I don't trust students to be involved. And I think one needs to really think about the different ways that students can be actively involved. So on one level, in terms of getting to grips and working on the assessment criteria, I think students have a massive role to play in that because the language we use in assessment criteria often isn't accessible to academics,
let alone
students. So I think they can help us a lot in terms of translating the words and the meanings to being something more concrete. I also think that students can play a part in designing and developing curriculum with staff, especially in terms of social media and how we can incorporate that more authentically within what we do. I do believe students can contribute to the development of teaching sessions and peer mentoring, but I also do believe that we need to train students. I hear too often that students aren't capable of giving useful feedback. Well, if they're asked to give feedback that they can't give feedback on because that's not an area they've got knowledge on, then we set them up to fail. So it's looking very carefully about what specifics can they support each other on and how can they develop them. How can second and third year students mentor first year and second year students respectively? How can that be part of what as an expectation of a student coming into university? And again, the argument I get back is in England, students are paying £9,000 fees. That's not what they come to university for. But anybody who's come from a pedagogical background will know that by trying to explain something to you, I need to understand it myself. And if I can't explain it to you, it means I haven't really got it. So students who are mentoring others gain colossally from doing that. So I think they can be involved in that. I also think in terms of data analytics, there is an assumption that academics and students understand all of that. I think there's a lot of work to be done in what we can learn from the data that we have about patterns of usage of things and how that plays in. Are there particular things that we could look out from when a student joins that we know makes them vulnerable or less so, by looking at the way they engage or don't engage? There are assumptions about engagement. I get really annoyed about people talking about active learning. From a brain perspective, active learning means your brain is engaging with the content. It doesn't mean to say that you're out there jumping around and hugging everybody, but we often look at it in the wrong light. Just because a student hits the virtual learning environment 20 times and another student hits it once, does that mean the 20 times one is doing better? I think we need to have a much more mature understanding of how engagement plays with each individual. But I do think if we really do want students to work with us, we need to share some of those big decisions. And the big thing for me is about communication, about why are we doing this, why is it important? Because the central part of my framework is about beliefs and values. And if students do not buy into what we're trying to achieve, then we actually set ourselves up to fail from day one. So,
Okay.
there we go.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carol.